Hi, I'm Patricia Greenberg. Are we predetermined to live to a certain age? Are we doomed to our genetic history? And does lifestyle choices change the course of how long you live, how well you live? And even if you don't want to live long, or you do want to live long, are we going to find that information out, whether it's inevitable that we have an expiration date? My guest today is Sebastián Alvarado. He's the director of the Alvarado Lab at Queens College at CUNY in New York. The Alvarado Lab is interested in the plastic molecular mechanisms that shape a genome's response to natural changes in the environment. Welcome, Dr. Alvarado.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you'll explain the scientific gobbledygook as we go. You know,
Yes.
I sought you out after hearing you speak at a symposium in Los Angeles that was spearheaded by Fran Drescher of Cancer Schmancer. And the focus of that was, what can we do to minimize our risk for cancer, both food, fitness, the environment, et cetera. And then you came along and talked about epigenetics, and we want to hear all about that. Some people don't understand it. What I can kind of open the door is that programs like 23andMe are exploding as a way of us finding out, you know, not only our country of origin, but what our genetic predispositions to certain diseases are, as well as our inherent strengths and weaknesses. So tell us about what you do and how the science of epigenetics is evolving.
Yes, absolutely. And again, thank you so much for inviting me on your show. I guess a lot of the ways in which we kind of explore epigenetics is through the lens of genetics, right? And if you think about your genes and your genetics, it's really important to note that it's the part of you that's really difficult to change. And I always like using this example, you know, every single one of us at one point in our life was a single cell embryo or zygote. And then you became 2 cells, then you became 4, then you become 8. And, you know, today you're listening to this podcast or watching the show, and you're some 37 trillion cells, right? And every time you added cells to your organism, you copied that genetic information with incredibly high fidelity, meaning that genetic information is a carbon copy in those 2 cells, in those 4 cells, and to a certain extent in those 37 trillion cells that you are now. And despite that staying the same, in fact, it's going to stay the same even after you die, and you know, we collect DNA and extract it from a dead corpse, that information is still very much the same. But despite that, between being a single cell embryo, between, you know, being a child, going through puberty, becoming an adult, you know, and all those phases of your life, you change quite a bit. So how is that possible? How does a cell decide to become a skin cell, a neuron, a liver cell? There's many different fates that cells take. And within the context of a whole organism, there are many decisions and environments you can expose yourself to that really determine the outcomes of certain biological traits. So when you think about that, it's really important to pay attention to the processes that are capable of shaping gene expression. And then this is where we kind of start throwing around the term epigenetic, which, you know, for just breaking down, the word epi means above genetics. So basically the regulation of genetic mechanisms. And that is where we specifically study how our environment speaks to our genome, and ultimately how that dialogue can shape certain biological outcomes. And in the case of obviously humans, we're interested in how that can shape, you know, a disease outcome or a health outcome.
Dr. Alvarado, how early in the game do we need to know our genetic predispositions to intervene?
So that's an interesting question. In terms of, I guess, our genetic predisposition is likely to remain unchanged throughout our lifetime. And it's, you know, just with genetic diseases, it's really important to know how these genetic diseases progress. Sometimes you might have something manifest itself, you know, when you're 20 or 30 years old, perhaps when you're 40. Sometimes they have windows of development that happen at a very young age. And it all depends on the basic biology, the fundamental changes that are governed by those genes, and when they have the largest impact on a developing organism or developing person. So it really depends. It's one of those things where if it's a developmental disorder that can affect brain development, that's something where if it has its effects in utero, that window is a very small one, and it happens during pregnancy, right?
Mhm.
Other windows are a little bit more subjective to the environmental stimulus. For example, I would say Huntington's disease is something that really manifests itself at older ages. And it's something where those, the window in which you can affect and change those outcomes is probably pushed outside of early development when you're a baby or when you're in utero to maybe perhaps when you're older. And depending where those windows present themselves, allows you to effectively, not necessarily, I wouldn't go as far as changing the outcome, but perhaps shaping the outcome or perhaps the severity of certain disease outcomes.
So should we be doing these Ancestry and 23andMe? I know there's a couple of brands out there now. Should we be doing this to all babies when they're born?
Oh, I mean, if we put aside like, other ethical, like science
Yeah.
fiction dystopian tropes, I mean, I don't see the harm in it, but I do think that there's maybe a handful of actual genetic diseases that if you get a certain diagnosis or a certain mutation or a variant within the population, though there's only a handful. I mean, I'm kind of speculating here, but I would say there's, I don't know, let's say in the tens of diseases that are really something you have to worry about, but they're often very rare within a human population.
Mhm.
And for those reasons, I tend to err on the side of, thinking that maybe your genes aren't your entire destiny. They're a very important part. Like there's a reason why, between being a single cell embryo to being a whole human, you copy that information with such high fidelity because it is incredibly important. Um, but it does have a habit of excluding the complexity of our environment and how we interact with our environment in shaping our health. So is it important? Is it going to give you a lot of answers? I mean, with Ancestry, it's a very reliable marker. It's been incredibly accurate. I mean, I've used it. I was very impressed at how accurate it was
Mhm.
with our ancestry and our lineage. But when it comes to, sorry about that, when it comes to our health and disease, it's something that's a little bit more a combination of both our environment and our genes, and not just our genes alone.
As you well know, this is new, emerging. The science is in the grand scheme of the world, is very new. And most people doing these ancestry searches and genetic searches are of an older age. And
Oh,
a lot of reasons, like maybe someone was adopted and now all of a sudden there's a way of finding out who their family is, or someone comes down with a disease or cardiovascular disease in their 50s and say, do I have a predisposition? Does that mean I'm going to die in 10 years instead of 20? And they do these tests. And so, I say, what do you say to the older person? Can you still, I don't want to say manipulate. I hate using that word because later on we're going to talk about how that's kind of an evil. But you can take the wellness intervention at an older age and still have success with it.
so I mean, I'm as a person, I'm an optimist. So I'm usually trying to think in a very, like it can't hurt if at least we're doing something proactive, right, for our own health. But the nice thing is that the scientific evidence seems to be accruing over time. It just takes a really long time. I think that's another thing. If I can just to say it to your audience, it takes a lot of time to do these studies, to do them properly. And just like a lot of other things, there is a fashionable trend in science to do certain types of studies. So I'll say this much because I feel that it's important to rewind the clock on what we've learned about genes and genomes and things like that. But it was incredibly fashionable after sequencing the human genome in 2003, that the next 10 years, we just did a bunch of association studies between mutations in a population and a specific disease. And we thought that we could solve all of disease to a certain extent by just finding the gene that was responsible for different things. And in that regard, it did identify, risk populations, but again, a minority of what typically is seen in a patient demographic for a specific disease. We kind of ignored the idea of epigenetics because we were so thrilled about doing these studies and spending billions of dollars and finding every patient population and the genetic mutation that's responsible for disease X, Y, and Z. And it led to us not paying attention to these epigenetic processes. So now we're kind of playing catch up. we're realizing, oh, it turns out the epigenome is shaped and changing all the time. It's constantly dynamic. And because it's so dynamic, we need to be measuring it at multiple, longitudinal time points. And oh, it turns out these studies are a little bit harder to design than the genetic studies. And now we have to think in a completely new way. And I think that 2010s onwards, we're really pushing more on studying human populations, those exposed to different environments. And I think recent work looking at, epigenetic clocks has also put it in the context of aging. And within the context of aging, it's a lot more exciting and a lot more tractable to recruit populations. So going back to your original question, is there, with older populations, are we, is it less capable of, changing your biological outcomes? I would say, again, as an optimist, no, but as a scientist, reading just the few pieces of paper, the few papers that have come out in the last year or two, it does seem that there is the ability to make that impact on health. I'm thinking of a study that came out, the one that I shared at Fran Drescher's cancer event, basically looking at 50 to 71-year-old males, I believe. So, they specifically picked an older age demographic, and I believe it was an 8-week intervention that included changes to sleep patterns, eating well, having a fixed diet, having guided meditation. There was a long list of things that they basically tried to introduce. And using these epigenetic marks as a signature of, biological age as opposed to actual age, they found that this 8-week intervention was able to decrease, their biological age by 2 to 3 years. Again, this is using an epigenetic signature of age, an epigenetic signature which has been tested since 2013 or so. That's when the first few papers came out to look at how aging can be correlated with these epigenetic signatures. So the idea here is that if you lived a particularly healthy life within this clock paradigm, this epigenetic clock paradigm, the clock will register at a much slower aging, timing. So the idea is that you might register at a younger age, a younger biological age than your actual age. Similarly, if you smoke, I think that was a strong predictor of accelerated aging, you would actually register at a higher age. So this clock and this epigenetic clock and many of these epigenetic clock studies have been primarily focused on the acceleration or the deceleration of this mark to indicate biological aging. However, it's to my knowledge that this study that came out in 2021, I believe, was one of the first few that actually introduced an intervention. And this 8-week intervention, it seems, was enough to slow the clock 2 to 3 years. So it shows you that there is still a window that's open somewhere that can affect your biology in a way that can reflect on your biological age. Now, exactly how this epigenetic clock works is still a bit of a mystery. What I can say is from, the UCLA professor who came up with it, Stephen Horvath, he basically did it. He built it on a data set of some 20,000 individuals that have had these epigenetic marks profiled across age. And then he kind of built an algorithm around that population. There are new clocks that are also being introduced into the field. Other people are considering other factors in training these clocks. Artificial intelligence and big data are also come into the field because this is really big data. It is some 28 million sites across your genome that we're studying, and we're studying that across a population. So it's a very exciting time to be doing this work as a biologist, as a clinician. And I'm hoping that it's going to be, we're kind of at a turning point. We started learning about the epigenome mid-2000s. We've been getting excited about it in the basic science and basically understanding its fundamental processes and mechanisms. But it's been really getting traction in human populations and human population studies since the 2010s, I would say, until now. And it seems that it might continue going in that direction.
My next question is kind of two-part. We talked about, is disease preventable and reversible with lifestyle changes? This study's showing promise, but it's not guaranteeing we'll live longer. it's showing that right now, if you ate more vegetables and exercised more and took some weight off and stopped smoking, you'll have quality of life today. So I'm not questioning what you're telling me. I'm just saying it isn't necessarily a guarantee that you'll make it to 95 instead of 85. Is
You're
there a
absolutely
different sequence of things we look at in terms of the actual longevity, or is it just very present oriented? This is your status right now. This is
yeah,
your health status.
that's a really great question. That's a
Mhm.
great way to look at the data. When it comes to that, I think the one thing we have to do is really hope that 8-week change stays in one regard, because who knows, I'm imagining my dad in that group maybe not signing up, but it takes a really meaningful change to
Mhm.
your lifestyle to I mean it's not something, it's not a band-aid that you put on or take off. It's not that easy, right? I'm sure anybody who's tried to make these changes to their life really understands that it's not that easy. And of course, we have to wait ultimately to get an answer to that question in human populations. However, this is when a lot of the work that gets done at the basic level in the fundamental processes, specifically working with animal models, that it does make a bit of a difference. So I believe this is rather recent. It came out in the last month. I don't remember the exact details, but there's a group, the Sinclair's group, that was looking at an animal model where they were playing with one of these epigenetic mechanisms called DNA methylation. It's basically this chemical that gets painted on your genome, and when it gets painted in front of genes that are being turned on, it has a way of turning them off. So it's kind of like a molecular off switch.
Interesting.
But ultimately, the processes that govern the addition, the removal, and the reading of DNA methylation are actually really well understood because of animal models. And because they're animal models, we can obviously do things with animal models that we can't do with humans. And I believe they found that disruption of the DNA methylation system is very tightly linked to the outcomes of aging and aging populations. So this is from from work from David Sinclair's lab, specifically found that loss of epigenetic information can actually accelerate aging, and that this in fact can be reversed through epigenetic reprogramming. And it's really hard to, I mean, it's possible to do that in an animal system because there's all kinds of genetic manipulations and drugs and things like that that we can do with animals. We can't necessarily do that with humans. So that's something we're kind of trying to decode now. Like what type of information or what type of diet or what type of experience is going to paint your genome through these epigenetic modifications in the right tissues, the right way to live healthier. And that is a billion-dollar question right now. We know that we can read these changes to our genes. We can read these epigenetic changes to our genes. We are understanding how they are encoded, but it's really difficult when you realize that your environment talks to your biology in so many different ways. A point that I brought up, of course, that maybe you remember from Fran Drescher's event, was that if we talk about what changes a pattern of DNA methylation. I'm just going to focus on DNA methylation because that's what we do in our lab.
Okay.
But this is just one of these epigenetic marks. We think, okay, what else can change DNA methylation? The earliest studies that really made us excited about DNA methylation involved maternal behavior in animal models. So this is just licking and grooming from mothers to their pups. And that was able to add DNA methylation or remove it to genes related to stress. So a maternal behavior is capable of changing DNA methylation. Okay, that makes sense. There's some, it's really
a loving mother makes the person healthier.
So
if you want to really break it down.
Exactly. And an early developmental childhood, like good parenting versus bad parenting. I mean, this doesn't come as a huge surprise, but now we can trace it to molecular substrates, which is exciting, right? Then we're like, okay, what else changes? And then, I remember studies being done in the lab. I did my PhD, and they were looking at diabetes. And they're like, oh, look, diabetic populations. And, these animal models of diabetes also have unique signatures of DNA methylation. Oh, okay, I wonder what else changes. And then we kind of open these floodgates. And if you look at the studies now, so like I have the benefit of, sitting in my desk as faculty now, looking back as when I was a graduate student, and you can look back and you can say, oh, look, there were studies looking at how natural disaster can shape the epigenome of patient populations that were born during that natural disaster. Oh, it turns out the weather and the humidity changes the methylome or changes these epigenetic signatures. It turns out that if you send, was it the Kelly twins into, or if you send one of the Kelly twins into space, an astronaut, that going into space itself, of course, is going to change something, right? But among many of those changes, you'll find changes in the epigenetic layer of biological regulation. So it's easy enough to say that almost everything speaking to your genome has a way of shaping your biology and through the epigenome. But the exact process and mechanism is a bit of a mystery, and we're really curious to find out. We know that certain behaviors will lead to certain outcomes, but it's something different to understand the mechanistic process. Like, what exactly about licking and grooming from a mother and her rat pups is doing that, right? Is the licking causing the release of certain hormones, and then those hormones are recruiting proteins that go into those cells of interest. And how do they get into those cells of interest? And once they get there, how do they pick which genes they're going to methylate and demethylate? Like, those are standing questions, which is one reason why it's really exciting to do this work. But it's also it also kind of tells us, like, we have a long way to go before we have concrete answers, such as, now that we have your methylome, now that we have your genetics, this is the age, this is the day of the year of the month you're going to expire. Not to be too grim, but like, we're not there yet. But there's still so much more that we have to learn about these processes. But it does seem that this epigenetic stuff is particularly relevant. I believe another hallmark of aging, actually, is that your genome gets hypomethylated over time. Again, it's something we've observed, but what does it mean exactly? How and why, and what exactly is, what else is happening? It's a bit of a mystery. Some people think because a lot of your genome is made up of what we call vestigial fossils of viruses. So half of your genome is made of these things called retrotransposons or transposable elements. And these are just sequences of DNA that belong to a virus a long time ago. But what happens is that they colonize our genome, and pretty much half of our human genome is made up of these viral elements. And we think that some people have speculated, I'm just kind of going on speculation, none of this is maybe concretely proven, but a lot of people have thought that since half of your genome is made up of these viral elements, perhaps when you are removing methylation during aging, you're turning on these genes because it acts like a molecular off switch, and turning on these viral elements might cause inflammation that lead to a lot of the pathologies that we see and comorbidities that we see with an aging population. That's one, pet hypothesis. We're just throwing that out there. But again, it's a big question mark. It's a really big mystery. But it's one that's excited a lot of investigators to do a lot of good science.
A lot of what I was researching in, attending the conference and also doing a lot of reading is the, you talked about, the food and the fitness, and it obviously does have an effect on us. Let's see if it helps long term. But the toxins in our environment. And one thing that we've been focusing on as a society, and I think worldwide, is plastics in our environment and how it affects us and seeps in. So there's a lot of evidence that it's causing problems. But you talk about plasticity of the cells, and I don't mean that plastic, I mean the movable, the way it can be shaped. Do we have a natural, God-given, if you will, ability to kick toxins out of our body?
Well, I mean, we have organ systems that are dedicated to removing toxins, right? We rely on our liver quite a bit, and its proper functioning allows us to get these things. But I think the really dangerous ones are the ones that aren't, they're not on the list that the liver is responsible for. So the liver sees them and says, I don't need to get rid of you. You can stick around. And then we bioaccumulate those things, and they become, a health risk. And then I believe there's a lot of like plastics that mimic a lot of like hormones and things like that. So then your body is tricked into thinking you're supposed to be releasing these intermediate messengers, and those are the ways in which I'm familiar, at least with the toxicology of these types of things. So what's important to know, at least with the work that I do and with this epigenetic layer, we can start to kind of think of how these different toxins and plastics might in fact be causing a cascade of effects, right? That lingering unknown of what actually is happening. But ultimately, those lingering cascades of effects sometimes require a long-term change in a tissue. For example, if I'm, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example, one that would make sense given what we're talking about in terms of what you put in your body. If I'm thinking about, you know, diet and eating, too many calories and eating lots of fats and things like that, you're basically telling your body, like if I eat a steak every day. Not that there's anything wrong with eating a steak every day. Maybe there is. There probably is. But if I eat a steak every day, I'm telling my stomach and I'm telling my esophagus and all these tissues that touch the steak at one point that this is my diet now. And if I'm eating it day after day after day, perhaps the way my stomach is set up now isn't perfectly tailored to process this much meat. As a result of that, it's going to need to reprogram some of the cells to release certain enzymes that are better at breaking down red meats, to processing the metabolites that come from that. So in a way, your body's constantly learning from its environment, from what you put into it. So if you're putting plastics, if you're putting meat, if you're putting whatever, you're basically telling your body, like, this is what we do now. So, you got your instructions. Now you need to be able to adapt to this change in diet, to this change in toxins, to this change in whatever. The fact that we cough in polluted cities is a necessary response, because if we didn't cough, we wouldn't have a strategy of removing these things. But even the way your lungs respond to your environment are very sensitive to these changes, and it's supposedly all for your long-term survival and your long-term health. So it's really important to think about a cascade of effects coming from the introduction of a dietary change, a toxin change, or any of these things, leading to cells trying to learn with that information. The cells, independently of what you're thinking, learning and memorizing the best gene program to activate when they see those types of environmental insults, whether it be diet, toxins, plastics, what have you. But there's going to be a several things that happen, and it's going to create a feedback loop that's going to program those cells to best respond to them. And sometimes that response, while the cell thinks it's the best response, might in fact not be the best response for your overall health at a systemic level. So certain genes might get turned on as a response of inflammation, and they might cause more inflammation, and then you get all kinds of autoimmune disease and things like that are rather prevalent in populations. And some of them can be triggered genetically. You can be born with them. A lot of them can also be triggered environmentally, as a function of not just plastics, but the food, the air you're breathing, the anything really. And I think it's really important to note that there are parts of your body that are particularly plastic and that are constantly subject to these epigenetic rules or epigenetic parameters. For example, I mean, just think about your lungs. The cells are turning over in your lungs rather often. You breathe in air, and you have this surface area of everything that's around your immediate environment going into your body and staying there for a few seconds before you repeat this thing every day, right? We all have to breathe, right? So your lungs are constantly being exposed to those environments. So it's really important to consider, should I be smoking? Should I be doing these other things? Should I be in a polluted environment? Similarly, your skin, right? You go underneath the sun, you're going underneath, what types of, creams are you putting on your face? Like, those are all things that are truly, having an effect on those plastic tissues. Now, the good news is that because they are plastic tissues, because your skin is always regenerating, because your lungs are always, they're going through the cell turnover to replace the bad cells, or the ones that get, sick, or that have a problem, there is an opportunity to kind of, like, the window is a bit bigger for those tissues. Other things, the window is not so big. For example, your brain, a lot of people have done the research, and they found that, the tissues and the neurons in your brain, they reach a certain amount of maturation, and after age 25, that's what you've got. So if you took very good care of them up until the age of 25, you've probably got something, that's going to work with you and stay with you for a while. However, if you don't take care of it, there is no going back. And personally, what I've noticed in my field and the work that we do is that a lot of these epigenetic processes are very important in, human populations within the brain, because they don't really rely on cells replacing old cells as much as other tissues do. Therefore, the ability of a cell to regulate itself through various, layers such as epigenetic modulation or regulation, it becomes even more important that, those processes play an even larger role in certain biological outcomes, or in the way that circuits form and learning and behaviors happen. I hope I'm not going in too many different directions.
No, it's great. Dr. Sebastián Alvarado, he's the head of the Alvarado Lab, is with us today, and we are talking about the science of epigenetics, how our genes determine many aspects of our lives and our health, and how they can be potentially altered for our wellness. Now, do you think now that this has the potential for evil, mass manipulation, controlling the population? I know it's a
I
real,
mean,
it's a real James Bond, way of thinking, but
I don't know. I mean, I think that we never really learn, or we can never know enough about ourselves, and I think this is just another way of doing that. And I mean, I don't know about evil, but like there was always that threat when we started doing, the idea of personalized medicine, sequencing our genomes. Like, oh, what if they find out that I have this variant, and will my insurance companies will my insurance premiums change because they see I'm a risk population? But the reality is that there's only a very small population of people with certain genetic predispositions that are kind of unavoidable. For the most part, I would say, like I think, I don't know if you remember, as a joke, I mentioned how my 23andMe said that I have the athletic composure of like a power athlete. And if you see me, you definitely won't think that. But, there are some predictions that are just wrong, or predictions that require a certain environment or a certain activity or a lifestyle to really, you know, lead to that certain outcome. And when it comes to the epigenome, it is a dynamic thing. It is something that can change. So reading it once and finding out that, oh, it turns out I'm aging faster than I should be, and it probably has something to do with the fact that I smoke and eat quarter pounders every day. And it's not just that, it's also stress. I live a very stressful job where everyone's yelling at me all the time, or I'm doing, in IT, I'm in the IT department and everyone yells at me with their problem. All of those things have legitimate abilities to change your biology, to change the way you think about the world, and change your outlook. And even your outlook, I mean, has a huge effect. Like your mental ability to wake up with good attitude, saying, I get to do this. I'm excited to do something. I'm excited to live my life. Versus, oh, I got to go into work and everyone's going to be a jerk. And like all of these things have a way of kind of building up and changing you, right? But you can change you too. You can change the environment around you. I can quit. You know what I mean? I mean, obviously there are other stressors that might come from quitting, but perhaps I can find other meaningful ways to engage with the work that I do. Perhaps I can remove the toxic aspects of my environment. And I don't just mean, pollution. I don't just mean like the behavior of others that might be, toxic personalities. I mean, I think it goes without saying that, being around people that are nice to you and that, that support you and that you support them is obviously better than the alternative. And it's always funny to talk about this, because something that I always find myself saying, and it's very obvious, but it's nice to have this molecular signature, one that we can study and say, there it is, those are the genes that are changing. These are the effects that we've been able to measure. But the reality is there are no surprises, right? Is it such a surprise that I tell you, eat well? You know what I mean? Surround yourself with nice people that support you. Avoid polluted areas. Like, don't, like, all of these things are, or exercise, live health. Like, these are not surprises. So we basically spent, $1 billion to get the human genome. Once we got that, we realized, oh, but we're missing this whole environmental component. So we spent another, few $1 billion. Who knows how many more $1 billion we're going to spend to get an answer to these questions. And ultimately, the advice stayed the same. Eat healthy, right? Have a good social circle of people around you, get regular exercise, and you will live better. There are no shortcuts, is essentially what I'm trying to say. And then, there are some examples, and they can be resolved down to genetics, specifically the genetics of centenarians. There is, a small population of humans on this planet that have a habit of growing very gracefully past the age of 100 and higher than that. And that is specifically a genetic predisposition. So many of those centenarians have had a handful of mutations identified within a population. So in that example, you really do have people that are, you know, genetically predispositioned to live older. However, I bet you if you took any one of those people with those genes and, you know, pump them filled with cocaine and heroin, their life is going to be shorter. So obviously your environment plays a very important role, right? Or if they lived, you know, very unhealthily, like there are certain things that, you know, it's a very difficult equation to figure out. But, you know, in general, you know, there's still a lot left to learn, but the advice is the same, you know, eat well, and maybe don't rely too much on shortcuts. I don't know. I hope I'm not
Oh, you know,
steering.
I'm gonna hire you to be my publicist for Eat Well, Live Well, Age Well, because it's exactly right. I'm not gonna get rich off of this, but there it is. Sebastian, you've heard about the blue zones and the longevity in Sardinia and Icaria, Greece, and these 5 hot spots throughout the world. And it's genetic, but people believe, well, if I go live there, maybe I'll live longer. Real quick, interesting story. This man from Sardinia, immigrated to the United States. He was on Long Island and he developed lung cancer and he was in his 60s. And he thought, you know what, if I'm going to die, I want to die at home in my homeland. And he went back to Sardinia and lived to be 95.
Good for him.
So, you know, it's an interesting, he probably had the gene, the proper gene of longevity. You know, I want to just quickly do a little bit of a case study because I was hysterical laughing, listening to you about your 23andMe and the predispositions, because I did the same thing I went through. I was a heavy, unathletic child, and I found fitness and wellness when I went to Queens College and started going to the gym and eating well. And my parents, unfortunately, passed young, but they did not take care of themselves. One of 5 children, we all take very good care of ourselves, and so far, so good. So I got my 23andMe results, and it was 100% ethnically what our parents told us our whole lives showed up, 100%. I had 1% Iberian, which I thought was interesting because I don't know where that came from, but it's there. And then, of course, my daughter got a 0.5%, so it was accurate. We also are Neanderthal. And it said that I am more Neanderthal than 58% of the rest of their customers. So what does that mean?
Oh dear, I might be less skilled in answering that question,
Okay.
just because I know that it has to do with like the migration of human populations across
Yes.
Asia and, you know, out of Africa. And I guess there was a window of hybridization, who knows how many hundreds of thousands of years ago. In fact, probably have colleagues that are, you know, getting angry listening to me right now, kind of trying to get my way out of this question.
Yeah.
No. I mean, and I believe it is just the percentage of those regions of the genome that can be reliably traced to a Neanderthal lineage. But I don't think there's anything bad about that. I mean, it's
Right.
just how we got here, right? It's how all of our human populations and human evolution got us to be so, you know, diverse and adapted to every corner of the world. So I mean, I don't know if it means anything that affects your personal health. I think it's more one of those ain't it neat type of factors
Yes. Yes.
that get baked into the 23andMe. But no, I personally would not be able to comment too deeply on what that would mean.
I just thought it
Perhaps
was
there's
a funny
somebody else that.
thing. And you know, when you go back to 23andMe, more and more information comes out. You know, it's broken down even further. So it was actually very interesting to me. And you know, my closing thoughts, Sebastian, is thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you, what do you like about getting older?
I like watching my kids get. So I've got 4 children, and I guess I really enjoy doing the comparing and contrasting of how they're living their lives and how culture has changed so much over time, and just kind of reflecting on that. I'm trying to. I never thought about getting older till about, you know, maybe till I moved to New York, I would say. But I'm hoping to obviously, I mean, frankly, I'm hoping to adjust a lot of my lifestyle so I can age happily as well. I'm realizing a lot of the way my approach to work in general in the field that I am in was one that was maybe taking my health for granted. I've tried to make the changes for that, and personally, I think it's been for the better. In fact, I was going to mention about, changing your environment altogether. One thing that I've personally noticed in my own health is that I've had a lot of like gastro problems in the last 4 or 5 years, and I had no idea why. I was perfectly fine, and I love eating. I absolutely love eating. Maybe that was the problem, but I do field work. So just to give you an idea, even though we're talking about human populations and things like that now, a lot of the groundwork has to be done in animal model systems. And the best model systems are not necessarily the ones that are not good at adapting, but the ones that are very good at adapting, because they're the ones that are really subject to their environment. So our lab, we actually work with African cichlid fish. You might see some of them in the background here from Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi in the East African Great Rift Lakes. And these are animals that have really, if the water temperature changes, they can't, go to the Catskills or anything, like, you know what I mean? They don't get to change their environment. They have to adapt. So we study these animals because they have that ability to change. And if we understand it at their level, perhaps we can translate to how humans can change as well. So we study a variety of different things. But what I'm trying to get to is that I actually went to Zambia in November, and all of my gastro problems disappeared immediately. I would get sick maybe once, I don't know, once every 2 weeks or so on like bad times of the year. So once every 2 weeks. I was there for a month. And the one thing I was concerned with is that with the whole change of environment, the change of food, perhaps I would get sick, right? That's the one thing you immediately think of. I'm in this new country, I'm eating food that I don't normally eat. And if anything, I actually had a lot of pains completely disappear. I had a lot of health improvements. I ate more than I ever ate because I was eating delicious fish from the lake. So I ate more, and I felt healthier, and it just made me kind of reflect a lot on, what's in our food right now. And I know that the US, more than anything else, has a lot of like loose laws around what goes in our food compared to a lot of European nations and South America too. So I'm always kind of like aware of that and just overall concerned. But I think that it speaks to that that anecdote, that piece of evidence that you provided about, changing your environment when things all of a sudden look really, really bad. At the very least, that, change your environment as a whole and see how it changes your lifestyle. I mean, that's what we can do. And that's actually what I really like about my field. We can do something about it, right? If I tell you, you have the gene for this, good luck. You know what I mean? Like that's not hopeful. And I feel that because this science exists, because we actually know about it, and we're still learning more about it, and there's these really exciting studies coming out every year. It's something to invest more learning into. It's something that we can have control of, and it's something where we can put that power back in people's hands. We can say, hey, maybe if you change these things about your life, there isn't this genetic fatalism that you have to surrender to.
That's
but yeah,
very promising and very, very encouraging. And for more information and to reach out to Dr. Sebastián Alvarado, you can go to www.cuny.edu. Also can reach out to me if you have any questions or want more information. So thank you all for listening.